Montana, 1887. There are men who grow old gracefully, who move into the later chapters of their lives with the quiet acceptance of someone who has made peace with what is and what isn't. Jacob Walker was not quite that man. He was 58 years old, and he had not made peace with anything. He had simply stopped fighting, which is a different thing entirely. Though from the outside the two can look remarkably similar. He ran a cattle ranch 12 miles outside of Grover, Montana, on land his father had broken and his own hands had kept. 300 acres of high grass and rocky creek beds and the particular silence of a place where one person has lived alone for too long. The ranch was good. The cattle were healthy. The fences held. Jacob himself was the thing that had stopped being tended. Not dramatically, not in any way that anyone would have pointed to directly. He ate, he worked, he spoke when spoken to, and was considered by everyone in Grover County to be a decent man of sound character. He went to church on Sundays and to the feed store on Thursdays and came home both times without anything having changed. His wife Margaret had died 11 years ago, not suddenly. The fever had taken 3 months to do what it did, which in some ways was worse than sudden, because he had watched it coming and been unable to stop it. After Margaret, there had been grief, and then work, and then more work, and then a kind of settled quietness that he had eventually stopped distinguishing from contentment. He was 58 years old. He had a ranch and a horse and a good dog named Porter, who asked nothing of him but proximity. He had, without fully deciding, concluded that this was sufficient. He rode into Grover on a Tuesday in September for salt blocks and feed and a pound of coffee and nothing else. He came home with a name he couldn't stop thinking about, which was, all things considered, the more significant purchase. Clara Bennett had arrived in Grover 3 weeks before Jacob first saw her. She was 29 years old. She had come from Billings to take the position vacated by old Mr. Hennessy, who had retired in June after 22 years of teaching Grover's children everything he knew. She had dark hair and steady eyes and the particular quality of someone who listens completely, not waiting for their turn to speak, but actually receiving what is said and doing something with it. Within 3 weeks, she had become the most talked about person in Grover County, which was not a large county. 3 men had attempted to call on her formally. She had received them all with warmth and declined them all with clarity. The banker's son, Franklin Pierce Jr., prosperous, handsome 26, had sent flowers twice. She had put them in the schoolroom where the children could enjoy them, which Franklin had not intended, but Clara thought was the better use of flowers. Jacob watched none of this. He was 12 miles out and had no occasion to be in town more than once a week. She spoke to him first. "Excuse me," she said from the school. "House steps. You wouldn't happen to know where I could find someone who could look at my stove? It's been smoking badly since last week, and the children are suffering for it." He stopped his horse. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the direct, patient gaze of someone who has asked a reasonable question and is waiting for a reasonable answer. "Tom Briggs," he said, "hardware store. Tell him Jacob Walker sent you and he won't overcharge." "Thank you," she said. "Then I'm Clara Bennett. I teach here." "I know," he said. "Jacob Walker. I ranch." "I know," she said. He rode on. 14 seconds of conversation. He counted them later, which he did not admit to anyone. He did, however, mention Tom Briggs's name to Tom himself the following Thursday, just to ensure the stove situation was properly handled. "Already handled," Tom said with a look that Jacob chose not to interpret. "Good," Jacob said. He bought his coffee and left. Tom watched him go and said nothing, but he was smiling. Jacob didn't see that either. She came to the ranch for the first time in October. She had a student, young Thomas Aldridge, 11 years old. whose father ran the property 2 miles south of Jacob's. Thomas had been missing school, and Clara made a practice of visiting the homes of children who missed school. She stopped at his gate on the way back. "Your fences are in good condition," she said by way of greeting. He was repairing the gate hinge. He looked up slowly, the way a man does when he's not sure what he's looking at. "Thank you. Thomas says you taught him to ride last summer. His father asked me to. He says you're patient with horses." She studied the mare tied at the post. "And apparently with 11-year-old boys, horses are easier," he said. She laughed. "Quick and genuine. The kind that arrives before the person decides to allow it. I'll remember that the next time Thomas gives me trouble, though I suspect comparing him to a horse won't help." He almost smiled. Almost. She stayed 20 minutes talking about Thomas, the school, whether winter was coming early. When she left, he went back to the hinge and found, somewhat to his surprise, that the afternoon had acquired a quality it hadn't had before. She came back 2 weeks later with a book about cattle management she'd found in the school library. He took it. He had already read it 10 years ago. He read it again anyway, which he told himself was because the chapter on winter grazing had new relevance and not for any other reason. The third visit, he was ready for her. He had made coffee, 2 cups, without thinking about it. Then he had looked at the 2 cups on the kitchen table and thought about what that meant and decided not to think about it further. She arrived at 2, as she generally did, and he handed her the coffee, and she took it the way she took everything, directly, without performance, and sat at his kitchen table. She looked at the 2 cups, then at him, then back at the cups. She said nothing. He said nothing. Porter the dog walked in, looked at both of them, and walked back out. "Smart dog," Clara said finally. "Yes," Jacob said. "He knows when to leave a room." There was a pause. Then Clara smiled into her coffee and Jacob looked at the wall in the kitchen was very quiet and somehow, inexplicably entirely comfortable. The town noticed. Towns always notice. By November, the Tuesday visits were known about. Clara rode past the feed store, and the dry goods, and the church on her way out of town, and people in Grover had eyes, and opinions, and most critically time. The opinions were various, and delivered with the enthusiasm of people who didn't have enough to discuss. Martha Hull, who had known Jacob for 30 years, thought it was wonderful. "That man has been alone since Margaret," she told anyone who would listen, which was everyone. "It's been 11 years. 11? I've been worried. Greater than. Franklin Pierce Sr. thought it was inappropriate and said so carefully to the right people. Tom Briggs at the hardware store, when asked his opinion, said only, he came back to ask about that stove. When pressed to explain what that meant, he smiled and found something to do in the back room. The banker's son, Franklin Jr., was less philosophical. He had sent flowers twice and had them returned, in the form of 20 children, who had very much enjoyed them, and had some feelings about the situation. He encountered Jacob at the feed store on a Thursday. "I hear Miss Bennett has been visiting your ranch," Franklin Jr. said with the careful tone of a man trying to sound casual and not quite managing it. Jacob looked at him. "She visits Thomas Aldrich's family, too, and the Hendersons. She visits families of students. Twice a week." Jacob picked up his salt block. "Have a good Thursday, Franklin." He rode home. He was not, he told himself, bothered by the conversation. Porter disagreed. The dog could always tell when Jacob was lying to himself, and spent the evening sitting closer than usual. Ruth Deacon at the post office, who had appointed herself Clara's unofficial informant, reported the exchange to Clara the following morning. Clara listened, nodded and said he picked up his salt block and left. "Yes," Ruth said. "Good," Clara said. "That's the correct response." Ruth stared at her. "To what?" Clara smiled. "To not being bothered," she said. And she went to teach her class, and Ruth stood in the post office for a full minute trying to figure out what had just happened. Clara had not told Jacob, had not told anyone in Grover the real reason she had come to Montana. Not the short version she gave at church socials, not the practical one about the teaching position. The real reason, the one she had spent a year learning how to say, she was saving for the right moment. What she had learned in the year before, Grover was the difference between a life that looked right and a life that felt right. She had spent 29 years being told they